My name is Valentina Gabusi. I'm very sorry that my webcam just broke down just a few minutes before this webinar. Today we talk about literacy and about contemporary literacy, to be more precise. And we do that with a very special guest, Margaret Layton. So welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Valentina.
At least our teachers can see you, so it's this is the important part. So let me tell you something about Margaret Layton. So let me introduce her a bit. Margaret has had a long teaching career in both the British and the Italian education systems. She began teaching English language and literature and also history in secondary schools and then in a sixth form college. And in parallel to that, for 27 years, she organized and ran a summer language school in Surrey, teaching English as a foreign language. Then in 1999, she began teaching English at the Università Cattolica in Milano. And since 2006, she has been writing English textbook for the Italian secondary school with Marina Spiazzi and Marina Tavella. So before starting discussing about literacy, I want to tell you something about this webinar. This webinar is interactive, so you can make comments and write in the area just beside where you are looking at this video. The final part will be open to questions and discussion, so don't be shy. You can write your questions and I will make them on behalf of you all. So, Margaret, you can start. Now you can just move on our slides.
Okay, it's a bit strange not seeing Valentina, but anyway, hello to everyone and a warm welcome on this snowy day. Thank goodness we're online and we don't have to go out. I want to talk to you about preparing and giving stimulating and effective topic-based lessons. And let me just for a moment talk about the title. Contemporary. This is a key word because we need to motivate our students, as I'm sure you know. And one of the things that motivates them best is something that they find relative to themselves, to their own lives, something that they hear about, maybe on a daily basis. So these are global issues. Literacy, because of course our main aim is to encourage the language learning. We want our students to be able to express themselves confidently in orally and also writing. So what are the topics that I mean? When I talk about global issues that interest the students, I'm talking about things like civic education, thinking about voting. In the UK, they're already talking about 16-year-olds being able to vote. I'm talking about the right to education, the problems of immigration, the problems of the environment, gender equality, and any kind of inequality, social, political, monetary, economic, crime and punishment, whether gun laws should be revised. There are a lot of issues that you can choose from and create really quite stimulating topic-based lessons. Let's look at the structure. Of course, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose the topic that you want. And here I would advise you to be very careful about choosing suitable material. The internet is a wonderful thing. We have massive, enormous amounts of information, but some of it is biased, some of it is not suitable. Be careful. Look for authentic material. When you've chosen that, you can look at the structure here of a topic-based lesson. I see it in 4 steps. We can call them steps. We can call it structuring, scaffolding. A lovely new keyword in education, building up a scaffold within your lesson. Step 1. Step 1 is motivating the students, giving them something that will introduce them to the topic, engage them in the topic. This can be a picture, an image, a graph, a mind map. It might be quotes. There are lots of possibilities. It's quite brief, this section. because it is literally drawing them in, motivating them, stimulating them, hopefully engaging them in the topic. Once you've got their interest, you can move into step 2, which is more challenging. Step 2 can be an article, an excerpt from literature, a poem, a listening exercise, something you have chosen to develop the issue, to develop the topic you have chosen. Then we get to step 3. Step 3 is verifying the comprehension of the challenging piece of literature or article or journalism that you have introduced in step 2. Step 3 is normally questions and answers. It could be true and false. It's verifying that they have understood the text. And then you move on to step 4, which for me is the most stimulating part of the lesson, because here you're moving away from the text and you're moving towards the student's own opinions. Here is where they are building up their cultural awareness, but not only. Hopefully, they are also building up their confidence, expressing their own views on the topic. These are the 4 steps within the lesson.
I'm just reading all the comments on the platform, and many of our teachers are really excited about the idea of topic-based lesson, because they are just telling that they really engage students. So what you are telling us is very precious. Can we go a little deeper and maybe try to apply all this to a practical example?
Okay, before we do that, I just have to mention step number 5, because the lesson is in 4 steps, but there is actually a 5th step, which is the consolidation and the written work that usually your students would do at home. Make it brief. It can be a brief essay, it can be a report, an article, a blog, an email, 10 to 12 lines written well, much better than a whole page. Also, remember, you have to mark it. Now, as Valentina says, let's move on to a concrete example. And I'd like to go through 2 possible lessons with you. One is based on literature, and one is based on a journalistic article. The first one we're going to look at is the one based on literature. This one actually comes from a topic in Performer Heritage, which I'm sure you know is a literature anthology, but also has some very important topic sections, which give an excerpt from literature, but also a song, a poem, a journalistic article, all hoping to stimulate interest within the topic and give them the possibility of discussing, forming their opinions. The one I have chosen is topic 6, and it's Women in the World, the position of women. So let's look at step 1. The first thing we're going to do is show them a picture. Now, be careful. When you use pictures as stimulus to motivate the students, don't just say, you have 5 minutes to look at this picture and discuss it. Help them, guide them. Often, an easy way is the WH questions. What, when, where, who, and of course, why? Who's in the picture? How many people are there? What are they wearing? What time of day it is? What are they doing? Why are they there? Is it in this country? Is it in another country? This part of the lesson I would normally do as pair work. Bigger discussion groups, I think, are quite intimidating at the very beginning of the lesson. Pair work, quick discussion, and then move on. Here, step 2 is an excerpt from a book called Brick Lane. Brick Lane is an actual street in London where there is a sizable Bangladeshi community. And this book is actually written by Monica Ali, who was born in Bangladesh, but grew up in London, has a Bangladeshi father and an English mother. So Who better than her to understand the intercultural problems? Brick Lane, the main characters are Nazneen and Shanu. Nazneen is an 18-year-old Bangladeshi girl who is catapulted into London without knowing the language or the culture as part of an arranged marriage to a much older man, Shanu, who is 40 and overweight. The excerpt that we are going to look at is actually not about Shanu and the arranged marriage, but is more to do with the attitude of the community. In fact, Nazim is talking to a friend within the Bangladeshi community called Rabzia, and they're talking about a job. I'll get a job myself, I told him straight. Rabzia looked at Nazim, not sideways and skeptically, but straight on. What kind of job? Said Nazim. In Guripur, a sweet maker was a sweet maker, a shoemaker was a shoemaker, and a carpenter was a carpenter. They did not want to be teachers or librarians. They were not waiting for promotions. They did not make themselves unhappy. I started reading this to you because I would like at this point to talk about getting your students to read aloud in class. I feel very strongly that it's a wonderful experience for the students to hear their own voice speaking English. Reading, in some ways, is less intimidating than answering a question in English, because if they have to answer a question, they have to think of the words. They have to think of the construction. If they're reading it in a book, it's all there for them, and they concentrate on the pronunciation and on the understanding. I have always enjoyed hearing the students speaking, reading English. And what I often do to get as many of them to read as possible is ask them to go round the class one sentence each. Even with massively big classes that I have had in the past, this has worked well because the students enjoy the fact that it's totally random who gets a long sentence, who gets a short sentence. I enjoy hearing them. It's a way of checking on their pronunciation, yes, but don't correct them too much. Let them enjoy it. Another way of them reading out loud, especially in something like this excerpt, where you have characters speaking, is you can give different students a character. So in this case, you could have one student reading the part of Nazneen and one student reading the part of Razia, and all the rest of the class reading the narration, one sentence at a time. If you feel it would be helpful, then they can always listen to the CD. All these excerpts are on the class CD, so they could listen to that first and then read it. Or maybe you would like to read some of it as I have done just now. But I can't emphasize enough how valuable reading aloud is. It brings them all into the excerpt, into the text, the class together. So we've read it together, and now to bring the students further into it, I would ask them to look at themselves for the issues that we're going to discuss. Don't always give things to the students on a plate. Make them work as well. I mean, here, ask them to underline or highlight in the text the sentences or phrases that refer to these problems, the role of women, the problems of integration, cultural differences. Give them some time. What I have shown you here is a very short part of the extract, which is actually much longer. But I think we can see it even here. I have highlighted some of the sentences that hopefully the students would find, like the first one, not sideways and skeptically, but straight on, to show the tension that this subject of work is bringing up between the husband and wife. The second paragraph, where there is the contrast between people accepting their work and their position in Bangladesh and in people in Britain wanting to be something else, wanting promotion, not being happy. In fact, they use the interesting adjective unhappy. The next paragraph is about the attitude of the community to women working. She started work and everyone said, he cannot feed her, implying that it is bringing shame on the husband if the wife is working. In fact, the husband went on to dishonor his wife, going with other women. But it was the wife's fault. So Yorina has brought shame on them all. Then we see the whole attitude of the community. She will not be the only one. Razia puts on a fight. Let the community say what it will, but we don't actually believe that she is so foolhardy. Because at the end, Natsine says, what does your husband say? Simple question. Razia narrowed her eyes. She looked down her long, straight nose at the baby. But she doesn't answer the question. Wonderful thing about literature is often what isn't said is as important as what is. It's the only way that we have of getting into somebody else's mind, seeing things from a completely different perspective. This is step 2. And we move on to step 3, where we have questions. Now, the questions, we could also have a true and false. The nice thing about questions is that they are all aimed at guiding, at helping students. Because the question in itself, look at number 1. How do we know it was difficult for Razia to talk to her husband about getting a job? So we're telling the students that there is the difficulty and they have to look for the evidence. These questions are testing specific knowledge within the text. They are focused on the text. This is very good training for the students, particularly for the Invulsi type tests that are coming up for them, based on reading comprehension. After they have done step 3, now here I would like to take a moment to talk about how you're going to correct this work. Because as I see it, there are different options. You can take the work in and correct it at home and perhaps give it back within a day or 2 or 3. Or you can correct it there and then with the students in 2 different ways. Either each student corrects their own work, or you could swap them round and you could have peer valuation where each is correcting someone else's. In my experience, I find that with peer evaluation, they pay more attention to correcting the work properly. And I think perhaps learn more from it. But they also learn if they're correcting their own. You know your students, you know which is the most suitable for them. Different options. I quite like these last 2 because they give an immediate feedback at a time that the students still have all the issues, all the expressions in their mind. And it saves you time for marking. But again, you can maybe vary. Sometimes do one, sometimes do the other. We're now moving on. After step 3, of course, comes step 4. And as I said before, this can often be the most stimulating and exciting part of the lesson, because the questions are all focused on the text. This is no longer focused on the text. Here in the text, we're talking about a Bangladeshi community in London. But the problems of integration are very similar for all immigrants going into another country. We think a lot about those from developing worlds going into developed worlds and trying to fit into a completely different culture. But any movement, even within a country, can cause problems of integration. I'm sure that a student from Naples would find it quite hard to fit into a school in Turin, at least at the beginning. So here in the class debate, it's much broader. Divide the class into small groups, but guide them. Don't just say, talk about the things that we have talked about so far for 5 minutes. Choose what you would like them to talk about. Like, for example, the role of women. Should women work? Why is it that it's acceptable for a man to work and a woman to stay at home, but it's not acceptable for a woman to work and a man to stay at home? You might like to look at integration. Why is it that often it is the woman that finds it more difficult to integrate in a new society, in a new community? Or you might also like the tricky issue of arranged marriages. I'm sure with my students, if we talked about arranged marriages, they would instantly all be negative. But what you could do is say, I want you all to think of 3 advantages from an arranged marriage. Give them a task. This is step 4. This is what you do in the classroom. But now we move on to the consolidation, the written word that they're going to do at home. In this case, I would give them something simple like an email. Imagine you are Nazim, writing to a friend in Bangladesh about her new life in London. If this is too female for the boys in your class, it could perhaps be Radzia's husband, writing again to a cousin in Bangladesh about what his wife wants to do. Short and well thought out. Consolidation.
Margaret, can I ask you something? You choose this example with literature. Can I ask you why do you think using literature is so effective?
This is a wonderful question because I think literature is a very precious part of language learning. And because literature enriches the language, I think all students learning the language must have some literature to develop a more flexible mind, to give them insight into not only contemporary issues, but different perspectives, different way of looking at things. And how better than through literature? It's interesting that often they think that literature that's not contemporary is no longer relevant. But this is absolutely not true. And I'm sure all the teachers know, all great literature is always going to be relevant, is always going to be talking about important issues. The role of the women is as important in Jane Austen as it is in Shakespeare, as it is in Monica Alle's Brick Lane. You can always use literature to introduce issues. And the beauty of the language is going to give students a voice, give them a different way of expressing themselves.
There is another question from our teacher in the comment area, and this teacher, Paola, she's asking you how about the preparation of language to be used in these tasks. For example, in phase number 4, some words might be required, and so how can they manage with all this word and lexical? I mean, how can they just help students in using words?
Well, vocabulary, of course, is an enormous area, and I think it's a very good example of scaffolding because you're building on vocabulary all the time. In a topic-based lesson, what I would do is make sure that either the words that are relevant and that have come up in the text or in the discussion are written down on a board. I don't know how many teachers still have an old-fashioned blackboard, but to write them up on a board, on a whiteboard, so that the students actually have them there for that discussion. Maybe they could write them down as well. They could you could give them lists of words to write down from the text that would be useful in the discussion. And of course, they're never going to stop learning vocabulary. the more they learn, the more they will be able to express themselves. But in the context of the topic, you must point out the words that are going to be useful. I hope that answers the question.
I think you do. Okay.
Moving on, Brick Lane, as we mentioned, brings up problems in multicultural Britain, integration, immigration. These are global issues. These are also, as we said, timeless issues. And this area of global issues is becoming increasingly important because within the area of competencies, 21st century skills, there are key areas that different subjects are going to have to deal with, which are economic literacy, health literacy, the global issues, and the, can you move on to the next slide, Valentina? That's it. These 20th century skills that are being talked about more and more, because these are the tools that we are going to give the students for their future life in a very uncertain and difficult career and work market that they are going into. These are interdisciplinary skills and issues. And in our new language book, which is Performer B2, coming out next week, there is a whole section that is devoted to these 21st century skills as dossiers. And I'm going to look at a part of the first dossier with you to give you another example that is not based on literature. Again, we need to look at authentic material. We need to research carefully what we're going to use with the students. And we need to be aware that the aims now are not only in what we call hard skills, which are giving students the knowledge, they are also aimed at soft skills. These wonderful indirect skills, if you like, that are creative thinking, problem solving, decision making, critical thinking, time management, teamwork, leadership, all these wonderful tools that if students can gain, they will be immeasurably important when they later go out into this flexible work market. And I want to show you how these can be, how these can be learned within a language context. We'll look at that a bit later on. First of all, we're going to look at the, as before, the steps of our topic-based lesson. So we need to motivate the students. Then in step 2, we need to show them something more challenging. In step 3, we need to verify their comprehension. And in step 4, we need a class discussion. This that you can see here is a page from this dossier section that I was talking about. The challenge of integration. So the motivation, step 1, you can use a picture. You can use questions. In this particular case, the key word is obviously integration. So you might ask the students to give you a definition of integration, to maybe find a synonym in English that has the same meaning. Bring them into it. Bring them into it. And from there, pass into step 2, which is looking at the article. And again, I'm going to read you the first bit. And I'm moving on a bit quicker than Valentina here. So here we are. This is the article. And talking about authentic sites, this one comes from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And going back to what I was saying about reading aloud, I'm going to read the first part to you. So, the integration of migrants and refugees is one of the most complex challenges of our era. Effective integration policies can enrich countries economically, socially, and culturally, generating new opportunities for development. There are many stories of successful integration around the world. However, looking at recent campaign speeches and referendum and election outcomes, reading the newspapers or watching the news, you might get the impression that international migration is out of control, that governments are feeble in the face of unstoppable movements, and that migrants are threatening the social fabric of many countries. I'll just underline once more before we move on, just what a rewarding experience I think that reading out loud can be. And it's a good way of gaining confidence. We're thinking about this problem solving, overcoming difficulties, gaining confidence. In a piece like this, and again, I have only put the very first part of this, and the article is much longer, as you could see from the page before. But just to give you an example of the kind of vocabulary work that I would do before going on to step 3. As you can see, I have highlighted words that I think might be interesting or challenging for the students. And I would do a vocabulary exercise. You have a choice of 2. You can give the students the Italian word and ask them to look for the English equivalent. For example, I might say sfide, and hopefully they would say challenges. I might say tessuto, and this they might find tricky. Good students might come up with fabric, but if there's no immediate response, I could maybe talk about tessuto sociale, and then they're more likely to come up with social fabric. The other possibility is giving them another English word, and they have to look for one with the same meaning. So that if I said weak, hopefully they would say feeble. If I said results, I'm sure all of you already are coming up with outcomes. Make, better, improve, they would say enrich. These are the kind of words, going back to the question from Paula before, these are the kind of words that I would ask them to underline and perhaps make note of, and then they could use them later on in a discussion. They would use them in their written answers, and hopefully they would also use them in the discussion to follow. After you've done the vocabulary work, after they've read the article, then we move on to step 3, which is questions. As we said before, the questions are very specific and focused on the text, often focused on very small portions of the text. They are testing their comprehension. The kind of questions here, Valentina, if we look at the next slide, again, are helping the students look at the issues involved. How can good integration policies improve the life of the country? What is the current general impression about international migration? Moving them towards a discussion. And as I said before, you can either collect the work in, mark it yourself, allow them to mark it in the lesson. The advantage of doing it immediately is because it is still all in their head while you're doing it. Then we move on to part 4. Before we do this, we are verifying the students all the time, but occasionally I think we need to step back and verify our own progress within the lesson and our own checklist. Have we introduced the topic effectively? Have we motivated the students? Have we given them the chance to talk about it before pushing them into a more challenging article or literature piece? Have we evaluated their comprehension of the text before moving on to the final discussion or debate? Debate is something we will talk about in more detail later. Let's have a look at the class discussion. Now, as I said before, I have always felt that this part of the lesson can be an extremely fruitful, lively, and interesting part of the lesson. It needs to be structured. If it is not structured, it can easily fall into all of them, speaking and talking and creating a noise. You need to structure it. So how do you structure a discussion? Here we give them the question, is migration a threat or an opportunity? Then divide the class into groups of 3 or 4, depending on the numbers of students you have. Make sure that each group has at least one strong, confident speaker. Avoid friends being together and weak students being together. And within the group, they are going to decide who is going to be the spokesperson who will give the feedback to the rest of the class. Give them a very specific task. It is too general just to give them the question, is migration a threat or an opportunity? Give them a very specific task. Here, for example, you could ask each group to come up with 3 benefits from migration and 3 problems. Time this part of the lesson, 5 to 7 minutes. 5 minutes doesn't sound very much, but they can actually say quite a lot in 5 minutes. Time it so that there is still some time left to bring the class together and discuss it all. Get the feedback from the different groups. And of course,
sorry, can I just ask you something from our teachers? Maria Cosima is asking something related to this theme of the group discussion. And she's writing, sometimes the students do not collaborate during group work. What can I do?
That's quite a tricky question, isn't it? I know there are a lot of teachers that find group work difficult. I think, and we're going to go into this a bit later too, because I think it's a very important thing to do with your students. I think you have to persevere. I think if you can find a topic and an issue that really interests the students, if you give them the tools, if you give them the vocabulary, you can even discuss certain phrases with them to use. I think it's worth keep on trying to get them to do group work. You could maybe start with a class discussion if you find that easier. Go into pair work. I personally use pair work for the beginning of the lesson and try to use group work towards the end of the lesson. When I feel that they should have more arms, more armor, because they've learnt some of the vocabulary, hopefully. And I think it can be difficult with classes. I don't think there's any magic formula for making it work, apart from perseverance from the teacher. And I think if you are determined and feel that it's worthwhile to do it, you will convince the students. Get the stronger students on your side. Put each one of them, make them kind of group leaders within certain groups. You might find that 3 and 4 is not enough, that maybe a group of 5 or 6 with a strong group leader will work better. Experiment in different ways. That's all you can do, because it depends a lot on the class. I'm not saying that it's easy, but I am saying that it is tremendously worthwhile. Learning to express their views and opinions in English is going to be tremendously worthwhile, not only for their qualification, for their maturità, but for whatever they do later on. Think of the soft skills. Okay.
Okay, in the meanwhile, I'm here, so I managed to activate my mic. I don't know. And hello, everybody. I'm very happy that with my face I can ask you this. You mentioned before a very a specific form of discussion, which is formal debates, which intrigues teachers, but also, I think, scares them just a little bit. So can you explain how we as teachers can do that in our classes in order to have like some instruction and also some steps to try this new form?
The formal debate is something that happens a lot in the UK. I find it extremely worthwhile. It takes effort from the teacher and the students, but I find that it is tremendously worthwhile. The class discussion is structured. The formal debate is even more structured. And you need to follow it quite precisely for it to work well. And when it works well, it is a tremendous kudos as well for the English class. You should get it videoed so that if your school has an open day, you can use the video as an example of what your class is doing within their English program. So how does the formal debate happen? Well, first of all, you need a motion. A motion is a statement that people can be either in favor of or against. In this case, we could, as a motion, have, this House believes that migration is not a threat, but an opportunity. You then need 4 speakers, 4 students that you can choose from the class, a main speaker who will speak for the motion, and their assistant speaker, who is actually called a seconder, who will also be for the motion. Then there will be a speaker, a main speaker against the motion, and they also will have an assistant speaker called a seconder against the motion. The way the debate happens is, first of all, the main speaker for speaks, then the main speaker against, then the seconder for, and then the seconder against. After these 4 speeches, which had been carefully prepared, of course, beforehand, and should have a claim, a comment, evidence, and a conclusion, and the debate is open to the rest of the class. This means that all the rest of the class can make their own points, can question the speakers, can ask for clarification. And I think this part needs to be timed because it could go on for a long time. And at the end of that, the 2 main speakers have another opportunity to speak. This time, the speaker against the motion speaks first, summarizes the points that have been made, the main points perhaps in his own speech, but also maybe some of the points that have come up within the class. And then the last speaker is the main speaker for the motion, who does the same, summarizes the main points, tries to make their point clearly, and after this, there is a vote. The vote is normally done by the raising of hands, and after which the motion is declared passed or defeated. This is the structure of the debate. As I said before, it requires preparation. In fact, I think it requires preparation and discipline. What do I mean? If we move on to the next slide, I think within your class, you must discuss and make sure they understand the basic rules of class discussion. And what are these rules? The way I see them, they are that one person speaks at a time, nobody interrupts anybody else, nobody raises their voice, and then this last point, which is undervalued, is how important it is to listen attentively, and that listening is actually a great skill. Give the speakers enough time to prepare a speech Possibly they can show it to you and go through it with you before the debate. But the rest of the class must also use the time to prepare for the debate. So you should ask everybody to think of at least 2 points for the motion and 2 points against, so that they are ready to join in when it's open to the whole class. It's again something that requires quite a lot of effort, but really is something that is tremendously worthwhile to do. You need a chairperson that can either be the teacher or it can possibly be one of the students. And this is the person who invites the speakers to speak and who allows the students to join in when it's open. So this is the person who decides who will speak when. So students who want to speak can raise their hand and the chairperson will make a note of their name and call them to speak. It's quite a formal exercise. It's not something that you can do at the end of every topic-based lesson. It's something perhaps to do once a term as a special event, and think of the soft skills that the students are learning through this kind of exercise. Think of the creative thinking, think of the decision making, and the speakers, think of their skills of leadership, problem solving, and all of it, if you like, is a kind of teamwork. So,
can I ask you how much time a teacher would need to do all of this in her classroom, and also students including preparation? And I mean, the time issues is quite an important issue in the online debate I'm seeing on all the teachers who are listening to our webinar.
I think that the first time you do it, it requires more time because the students aren't aware of the structure, of the way it's done. But a lot of this preparation time is done out of the classroom, so you can set the speeches as a kind of homework. You can set these points that they find as a kind of homework, and then bring them in together. The first time, they may find it tricky, the organization of the debate. But once you've done it once, I think it then becomes almost automatic. And in my experience, the students quite like a structured debate, quite like the idea of the formality. In fact, what we normally do is have the speakers sitting out in the front. So you have the chairperson, who might be the teacher or might not, sitting at the teacher's desk. Then 2 chairs on each side for the main speaker and the seconder, so that the whole structure of it is formal. And I have found that when they get into the habit of doing this kind of debate, the second and the third time is much quicker. So, we have talked about topic-based lessons based on literature. We've talked about topic-based lessons based on an article. We've talked about the importance of class discussion and debate. And all of this, hopefully, is to show how contemporary issues can be used to stimulate, motivate, and encourage language learning. And that the literacy, in the next slide, the literacy which they gain, the confidence in speaking and writing, in understanding and appreciating and using language effectively. This is what I understand as using contemporary literacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. There's a specific question about formal debate, which is linked about rotation. I mean, just to have all students more involved, and in order to do a formal debate maybe twice a year, would it be interesting to select a group of students and then rotate the position in the second term of the year? Or do you think that all classes should participate?
I think that there's a funny echo. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think that very much is a decision that the teachers must make within their own school. It may be that they want to select students from different classes to do it as an inter-class action. I think that would work very well. If they're doing it within the class, and if they do one each term, I definitely think they should rotate the students who are taking the role of speakers. It's quite nice to put in the role of chairperson one of the weaker students, to give them a possibility of a new role, to give them this possibility of learning the soft skill of leadership. Leadership is not only a skill for the better students, some of the weaker students can learn leadership skills as well. I hope that answers the question.
We also have another question from Simona, and she's asking, do you think that formal debate can also apply to literature? For example, different students representing different views on poetry, or adopting perspective or different character on a specific issue?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it could be a wonderful opportunity for formal debate. You could really be quite provocative. You could, if you are doing Romeo and Juliet, you could have a debate on love at first sight doesn't exist. This house believes that love at first sight doesn't exist. I could see it in lots of different literary contexts. I think it would be very exciting to do a formal debate on literature.
Okay, many teachers are just quite amazed by the formal debate. Many of them never tried it, so they are just discussing how it would be great to try that on this year, in the next few months. And also they thank you for all the suggestions and the very practical topics you mentioned. They also are asking, what age would you recommend for debates? When to start?
I think that's a very good question. And I think that depends an awful lot on your relationship with the class, because obviously you've got to look at their level of language. They need to be able to express themselves on a certain level. I would see a formal debate as something that you might do in the 4th year. If you have a particularly able 3rd year, you might be able to, but it is obviously something that requires a certain amount of articulation within the language. It could be frustrating at an earlier time. I mean, class discussions you can have right from the 1st year, of course. And getting back again to what the teacher Paola was saying earlier about learning the vocabulary, they can start that scaffolding with vocabulary from a very early age. It's a bit like people often ask me in the past about when to start teaching Shakespeare. And, you know, I personally think you can teach Shakespeare from a very early age, from senior 1, which is 11-year-olds in England. But it depends on the class, it depends on the teacher. You have to believe strongly. I would really think that a formal debate, for it to work effectively, I would do it in the 4th year.
Okay, thank you very much.
But having said that, I would be very interested to hear from any teachers who have tried it out in their classes and maybe can do it very effectively with the 3rd year. So I look forward to hearing from people.
Okay, so maybe next year we'll have another webinar with all these teachers who tried your suggestions for...
That would be fantastic. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Okay.
There's a final slide, which is a sort of useful link or a present for our teachers, isn't it?
Oh yes, I forgot to mention in the talk that while I was talking about the 21st century skills that are fundamental and are becoming increasingly important, there is a very explicit, very good website, which is the link that Valentina is showing you now. This gives a lot of information about the hard skills and the soft skills and the importance of these competences for the future of the students. I found it extremely interesting and worthwhile.
Okay, so thank you very much for this webinar. Thank you all for staying with us. We were more or less, it was like 200 people, 200 teachers debating and your words. They all thank you, and I thank you, Margaret, for being so inspiring and for, I mean, giving us a lot of very practical example and very suggestions and so on. So many of our teachers are really excited to go to school tomorrow and try some of your advice.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see in a future webinar again. So thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.